Before Wallis Simpson shattered a monarchy, Freda Dudley Ward held the heart of a prince destined to rule, desperate to escape, and doomed to fall. For 16 years, she wasn't just Edward's confidant or lover. She was his obsession, his sanctuary, and the woman who dared to defy the confines of royal tradition. Their love story played out in the shimmering ballrooms of Mayfair, the hushed shadows of Cumberland Terrace, and the scandalous whispers of society's elite. It was a bond forged in passion, tested by betrayal, and undone by the weight of a crown. Yet, as Edward's desires pulled him further from the throne, Freda stood firm, refusing to be consumed by a prince's demands. When heartbreak struck, Freda didn't crumble. Instead, she rose, turning scandal into strength, tragedy into triumph, and loss into lasting purpose. From the glittering heights of high society to a life rebuilt in quiet resilience, she left an indelible mark on history. This isn't just a tale of forbidden love. It's the story of a woman who stood at history's crossroads, shaped the destiny of a prince, and forged her own extraordinary path. If you like stories like this, please consider joining the channel. We post new content on amazing women every week, and we'd love to have you with us. Now let's get into the scandalous life of Freda Dudley Ward, the woman who ruled a prince. Winifred May Birkin, later known to the world as Freda Dudley Ward, was born on July 10, 1894, into a world shimmering with privilege, yet stifling with expectation. In Nottingham, where sprawling estates whispered of industrial triumph, Freda's life unfolded beneath the weight of her family's fortune. Her father, Colonel Charles Birkin, ruled their household with an iron will. He carried the legacy of the family's lace empire, a business as delicate and unyielding as the man himself, built in the gilded heyday of Victorian prosperity. Within the imposing walls of their home, silence often reigned, broken only by the ticking of the clock or the scrape of cutlery at formal dinners. In this austere world, it was her mother, Claire Lloyd Howe, a New Yorker with a Parisian soul, who brought light and warmth. Nicknamed Pearly for her luminous smile, Claire was a creature of music and laughter, weaving life into the quiet corners of their home. Her laughter rippled through the halls like the first notes of a waltz, softening even the house's coldest shadows. She introduced Freda and her siblings to impromptu theatricals and whispered stories of far-off places, nurturing in Freda a hunger for beauty and adventure. Her father's unyielding discipline clashed with her mother's spontaneity, creating a quiet tension that shaped her early years. Freda longed to escape the heavy ritual of Sunday dinners and the rigid expectations that surrounded her, to step beyond the lace curtain of decorum and into a life entirely her own. Her rebellion began as a quiet murmur, a storm forming just beyond the horizon. As the eldest of 4 children, Freda was expected to embody perfection, composure, obedience, and grace. Outwardly, she fulfilled these demands, presenting a polished facade that upheld her family's image. Yet beneath this veneer, her spirit burned with restless energy, a yearning to escape the tightly woven fabric of tradition. That yearning boiled over during her time at Heathfield, an elite boarding school where decorum was prized above all else. One stifling summer afternoon, when the weight of routine became unbearable, Freda led her friends in a daring escape. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass as they scaled the school's ivy-clad walls, skirts catching on the rough stone as they laughed their way to freedom. Their destination was the Ascot races, where Freda found herself amidst a sea of bright hats and champagne glasses, the hum of excitement like a song she had been waiting her entire life to hear. The fallout was swift. Her escapade, though thrilling, led to her expulsion. To Freda, it felt like a small price for the taste of rebellion. To her parents, it was a disaster. Scandal followed her home like a dark cloud, shadowing the Birkin name. Her father, stiff with disapproval, decided she must be sent far away, to America, where her mother's family could shield her from the critical eyes of Nottingham society. In New York, Freda's magnetism proved unstoppable. At every gathering, she captivated with her wit and charm, her laughter drawing admirers like moths to a flame. But even there, her restless heart remained untamed, searching for something more. That something arrived in 1912 aboard the Mauretania. The ship's deck glistened with salt spray as Freda reclined with a book in hand, her dark hair flowing in the breeze. 3 men approached her: Tommy Ager Robarts, Effie Smith, and William Dudley Ward. One, with a mischievous grin, plucked her novel and tossed it overboard, declaring it unworthy of a woman so brilliant. Freda's response, a laugh rich and defiant, ensnared them all. But it was Dudley, 16 years her senior and already a rising star in politics, who was truly captivated. Beneath her playful charm, he saw a fierce spirit, untamed and irresistible. For Freda, this meeting would be the first step into a life where love, scandal, and freedom collided, a life far removed from the gilded shadows of her youth. In July 1913, just shy of her 19th birthday, Freda married William Dudley Ward in a ceremony steeped in splendor at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of the historic chapel, society's elite gathered to witness the radiant young bride wed the charming and ambitious politician. Freda floated down the aisle in an ethereal gown embroidered with silver, her delicate veil secured by a wreath of orange blossoms, a vision of youthful grace and promise. The reception at Claridge's brimmed with laughter and champagne toasts, a glittering celebration of their union. Soon after, the couple embarked on a honeymoon through the United States and Canada, sailing once more aboard the Mauretania, a symbol of their shared voyage into a bright new chapter. The early years of their marriage placed Freda firmly at the center of London's glittering social scene. Dudley Ward, known for his sharp wit and charm, was a rising star in Parliament and a cousin to the future Viscount Ednam, whose own romantic entanglements with Lady Rosemary captured high society's attention. These interconnected circles would lead Freda closer to the Viscount after Rosemary's tragic death. But for now, their home became a hub of lively gatherings, where political intrigue mingled with the easy elegance of high society revelry. Freda thrived in this world, her vivacious energy drawing admiration from all who met her. In 1914, Freda gave birth to their first daughter, Penelope, fondly called Pempy, and in 1916, they welcomed Angela, affectionately known as Angie. Freda was lauded as a devoted mother, balancing the demands of society with her role at home. During the war, while Dudley worked in intelligence, she poured herself into charitable efforts, opening bazaars to raise funds for struggling country churches and delivering much-needed comforts to families in her husband's constituency. To those who met her during this time, she seemed tireless, a young woman who carried herself with warmth and grace, even in the shadow of wartime hardships. Yet beneath the polished veneer of their marriage, subtle fissures began to form. Dudley's political ambitions, which had once inspired Freda, now consumed his time. His duties as vice-chamberlain of the royal household frequently pulled him away from home, leaving Freda increasingly isolated. The vivaciousness that had captivated him now found itself constrained by the routine monotony of domestic life. Fate intervened on a chilly March evening in London as air raid sirens wailed their mournful warning. Freda and her companion huddled in the shadowed doorway of a grand house in Belgrave Square, their breath curling into the icy air. Overhead, the low drone of Zeppelin engines mingled with the sharp crack of anti-aircraft fire, a haunting symphony that pressed against the darkened city. Suddenly, the door creaked open, spilling light and laughter into the night like an act of defiance. A woman with a warm smile beckoned them inside, and Freda, with a quick glance at her companion, stepped into a world transformed. Inside, the party was vibrant, a startling contrast to the cold tension outside. The soft hum of conversation mixed with the clink of glasses, while candlelight flickered against gilded walls, casting dancing shadows. In the cellar, where the guests had taken refuge, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and melting wax. Among the subdued group sat Edward, the Prince of Wales, his elegant posture betraying a hint of restless energy. His eyes found Freda the moment she entered. Petite, with dark curls framing a face alive with curiosity and blue eyes that glinted in the dim light, she seemed to bring warmth into the room. Her laughter, light and unrestrained, rose above the quiet murmur, and Edward was drawn to her as though she were the only person there. When the all-clear siren finally sounded, the party moved upstairs, its tempo returning to a jubilant hum. Edward sought Freda on the dance floor, their movements fluid, a rhythm as natural as breathing. She smiled up at him, her eyes sparkling with mischief, and he felt himself forgetting the weight of his title. the war and the world outside. As dawn stretched pale fingers over the city, Edward insisted on escorting her home. Under the stark glow of a street lamp, they lingered, the cool air charged with unspoken possibilities. When he asked to come inside, Freda smiled, a gentle refusal that left him standing there, rooted to the spot, her laughter still ringing in his ears. The next day, he penned her a letter, eager to see her again, but a misunderstanding led it into the hands of her mother-in-law. Mistaking herself as the intended recipient, the elder Mrs. Dudley Ward graciously invited the prince to tea. When Edward arrived expecting Freda, he was instead greeted by the older woman's polite smile. Awkward, but ever the gentleman, he stayed for a brief cup of tea before excusing himself. Undeterred, he met her the following day. At first, he felt self-conscious and shy with her, but her easy manner soon made him feel relaxed. For Freda, having the most eligible bachelor in the world chasing after her was intoxicating. Edward became relentless in his pursuit of Freda, writing her letters daily, arranging clandestine meetings, and finding excuses to be near her. Freda, meanwhile, was far from an innocent participant. With her vivacious personality, striking beauty, and the rare ability to make even the most insecure men feel valued, she was irresistible. Their connection deepened during stolen afternoons at Kilby's farm, a secluded retreat owned by Freda's sister-in-law near Windsor. Here, away from prying eyes, they shared intimate conversations and moments of quiet joy. Edward later described these times as our best stunts, his letters brimming with fond recollections. The final German offensive in March 1918 cast a heavy shadow over the war, and with the country's back against the wall, all military leave was immediately canceled. Edward was sent back to Italy at his father's insistence. For Edward, the separation from Freda was unbearable. In the lonely nights that followed, he poured his longing into letters, written hurriedly in pencil and riddled with spelling errors, their imperfections only adding to the raw emotion within. He filled these notes with declarations of love and yearning, painting vivid pictures of his isolation. To conjure Freda's presence, he played their favorite songs, Have a Heart and The Little Cottage. On his gramophone, their melodies mingling with the faint echoes of artillery in the distance. He dabbed his handkerchief with her perfume, Royal Briar, inhaling its familiar sweetness as though it could bridge the miles between them. Her photograph, set in a worn leather frame, never left his side. It rested on his bedside table at night and traveled in his pocket by day, a constant reminder of the woman who had become his anchor. Edward's letters revealed a man desperate for connection, vulnerable to the point of childlike dependence. He filled the pages with puerile jokes, rhymes, and pleas for reassurance, often addressing her as Mummy and signing them as her very own little David. "What babies we both are, sweetheart," he wrote in one letter, "but I do love it so, and it does us both so much good." Freda, ever the steady figure in their dynamic, responded with tenderness tempered by detachment. She seemed to understand the emotional tightrope they walked, balancing Edward's insecurities with her own need for independence. While Edward pined for Freda from afar, her life in London took a different turn. Amid her work with the Voluntary Aid Department at a local hospital, she began a brief affair with Captain Reginald Seymour, equerry to King George and a distant relative of Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour. Seymour, aware of Edward's deep infatuation, affectionately referred to the prince as your young man in letters to Freda, writing that, "I fully accept my position as number 2. Edward, too, confessed his flirtations, though his dalliances carried far more dangerous consequences. He recounted an affair with French courtesan Maggie Meller, admitting she had begun blackmailing him with indiscreet letters. Maggie, known for her fiery temper and passionate affairs, had married an Egyptian aristocrat after her time with Edward. In 1923, their volatile relationship ended in tragedy when Maggie shot her husband during a heated argument in their London hotel suite, firing 3 bullets into his neck, back, and head, killing him instantly. At the Old Bailey trial, Maggie's defense painted her husband as a monster of Eastern depravity, a phrase calculated to evoke sympathy for the vulnerable European wife. The jury, shielded from her past as a courtesan and any mention of Edward's letters, acquitted her of murder. Maggie, however, never relinquished the letters from Edward, When she died in a Parisian hotel decades later, the crown discreetly recovered and destroyed the correspondence. At this point, however, still single, she was merely threatening to publish his letters if she were not paid a substantial sum. Despite his own confessions, Edward remained fiercely apologetic to Freda for his indiscretions. "I just grovel at my idol's feet asking forgiveness," he wrote. But Freda, with her characteristic poise, dismissed such affairs as little amusements that don't count. Her cool detachment seemed to disarm Edward even further, intensifying his dependence on her. In their letters, Edward found not only a lover, but a confidant. He unburdened himself to Freda, sharing his fears, frustrations, and dreams with a vulnerability he revealed to no one else. More than their physical affair, he cherished the pleasure of their conversations, often describing the joy of simply talking to her. He believed their meeting had been fated, sending her childhood photographs with notes that read, "I had always been waiting for you." His letters became increasingly raw, filled with baby talk and strange pleas. "Be cruel to me," he begged. "Curse at me. I am the certain kind of man who needs cruelty, without which I get abominably spoiled and soft." This yearning for domination, long before Wallis Simpson, revealed a pattern in Edward's romantic life. Freda, ever perceptive, navigated his insecurities with care, offering stability while maintaining her emotional boundaries. For her, the affair was both exhilarating and exhausting. After Edward returned from Italy, their relationship intensified. Often, under the cover of night, he would slip away from Windsor Castle on his bicycle, pedaling across quiet country lanes to the cottage where Freda stayed. Hours later, he would creep back into the castle before dawn, exhausted but exhilarated by their stolen moments together. His letters during this time also laid bare his growing disillusionment with the monarchy, describing Windsor Castle as this prison. The rigid routines, the stagnant company of aging courtiers, and the crushing weight of his role left him yearning for a life beyond the confines of royal duty. "That court life, beloved one," he admitted in one letter, "that's what's going to hasten the end of it. People can't and won't stand it nowadays." Even as Edward dreamed of a more liberated future, his ties to his family and his country kept him bound to tradition. For Freda, who cherished her place in his heart, this reality was inescapable. She knew she would never wear the crown or claim the title of queen, but their love flourished nonetheless, defined by its contradictions, its deep connection, and the ever-present shadow of impossibility. In September 1918, Freda and her husband, William Dudley Ward, were invited to dine at Windsor Castle at the request of the King and Queen. The invitation was a mark of respect for Dudley's position as Vice Chamberlain, but Edward was conspicuously absent from the evening. At this point, the royal couple had no inkling of the role Freda played in their son's life. Yet Freda's charm did not go unnoticed. George V, known for his reserved demeanor, appeared animated in her company. Edward, meanwhile, had hoped Freda would meet his sister, Princess Mary, but the introduction never materialized. As their relationship deepened, the couple began socializing more publicly, with the inclusion of Sheila Loughborough, unhappily married to Freda's cousin, Lord Loughborough. Together with Edward's brother Bertie, the group formed a secret circle. Their camaraderie was a welcome reprieve from public scrutiny, filled with private jokes, a mascot teddy bear, and evenings of carefree revelry. Edward and Freda, the self-proclaimed bear leaders, found solace in this inner sanctum, where their love could exist free from the prying eyes of society. London's glittering nightlife became their playground, with iconic nightclubs like Ciro's, Quaglino's, and their favorite, the Embassy, serving as their stage. The Embassy, known as the Buckingham Palace of nightclubs, was a smoky haven for aristocrats, actors, and socialites. Thursday nights at the Embassy became a staple of their social calendar, where Edward's entrance sent ripples of excitement through the room. The couple danced the Charleston on polished parquet floors, their steps perfected in private lessons with their instructor. Long after the music stopped, they mingled with luminaries like Tallulah Bankhead and Winston Churchill, reveling in the night's magic. After the clubs closed, the evenings often continued back at York House, where Edward hosted private performances by musicians like Leslie Hutchinson. Hutch, as he was known, was a celebrated pianist known for his scandalous affair with Lady Edwina Mountbatten. For more on their story, please see the video on Lady Edwina Mountbatten on the channel. York House, vast and imposing with its 75 rooms, could not quell Edward's sense of displacement. By 1919, he spent much of his time at Freda's grand home on Cumberland Terrace. Unlike York House, Cumberland Terrace felt alive, filled with warmth, conversation, and laughter. Edward would arrive in the afternoons and often stay late into the night. "I only feel at home here," he confessed to her, the weight of his words betraying the depth of his dependence on Freda's presence. Freda's husband tolerated her relationship with Edward, though the arrangement strained the limits of discretion. Divorce, however, was out of the question. It would have destroyed Dudley Ward's political career and disrupted their family's fragile stability. Instead, the Dudley Wards settled into a quiet separation, maintaining public appearances while leading increasingly separate lives. Freda dutifully accompanied her husband to events, but in London, their paths rarely crossed. During the 1918 general election, Freda campaigned tirelessly for her husband. She ventured into the slums of Southampton, witnessing firsthand the harsh realities of working-class life. She described these scenes to Edward, who was deeply affected by her accounts of poor housing and the struggles of ex-servicemen. These conversations kindled Edward's growing interest in social reform, one of the few passions that allowed him to escape the suffocating expectations of royal life. Freda's intellect and curiosity set her apart from the society women of her time. She thrived in political debates, often holding her own against the likes of Philip Sassoon and Frank Hodges. One friend described her as one of the brightest women I've ever known, a woman unafraid to voice strong opinions with confidence and charm. Yet Freda's sharp mind was balanced by a profound devotion to her daughters, Angie and Pempy. Unlike many aristocratic mothers, who relegated their children to nurseries and nannies, Freda brought her daughters into every aspect of her life. At Midsummer Fetes, Angela and Pempy danced as fairies and butterflies. Their matching outfits often graced the pages of society magazines, showcasing a mother who delighted in their presence. Freda's approach to motherhood was radical for her time, making her family an intrinsic part of her identity. Edward adored her daughters and embraced his role in their lives. Angie and Pempy affectionately called him Little Prince, treating him as an honorary uncle. He joined them for Charlie Chaplin films, sat with them cutting out paper patterns, and shared Freda's worries when they fell ill with flu or whooping cough. He never missed a birthday, ensuring the girls saw him not as a distant royal figure, but as a steadfast part of their family. For Edward, Freda was a source of stability in a life defined by chaos and duty. "Anything to please her," he would often say, deferring to her wishes with an uncharacteristic humility. Yet Freda never exploited his devotion. Unlike Wallis Simpson, she shunned extravagance, avoiding grand gifts or flaunting her influence. Instead, Freda used her position to help others, advocating for struggling ex-servicemen and supporting those in financial need. Her compassion and grounded nature elevated their relationship beyond the trappings of a conventional affair. The couple's bond was unmistakable. They behaved as though married, attending races, playing golf, and spending weekends at country house parties together. Edward would even turn down invitations that excluded Freda, unwilling to spend time apart. Their friends often marveled at their natural chemistry. Duff Cooper, after tea with the pair, remarked on Freda's impeccable manner toward Edward. "She made him shine," he wrote, always putting him at ease and revealing his best qualities. When whispers of the affair reached King George and Queen Mary, the reaction was swift and scathing. The king, ever conscious of the monarchy's image, dismissed Freda as the lace-maker's daughter, a thinly veiled insult that betrayed his snobbish disdain for her middle-class origins. Yet the royal scorn belied the truth of Freda's background. Far from being insignificant, the Birkin family was one of Nottingham's most respected dynasties, rooted in prosperity, patriotism, and philanthropy. Freda's father, Colonel Charles Birkin, was a decorated war hero who commanded the Robin Hood's battalion in France during World War I. Gravely injured in battle, he bore the lifelong effects of a fractured skull, a testament to his courage and sacrifice. Her mother, Claire Lloyd Birkin, an American by birth, was equally formidable. During the war, Claire transformed their stately home, Lamcote House, into a hospital for officers, dedicating herself to the Red Cross and wartime relief efforts. Her tireless work earned her honors from Belgium, France, and the United States, cementing her reputation as a beacon of compassion and resilience. After the war, Claire became a beloved figure in Nottinghamshire, leading charities, the Women's Institute, and the Nottingham Cancer Campaign. She even served as president of the local Women's Conservative Association, a role that highlighted her influence and dedication. Freda inherited her mother's energy and sense of purpose, blending the glamour of her London life with her family's philanthropic endeavors. Often returning to Lamcote House, Freda used her connections to support her mother's causes, seamlessly bridging two worlds. Freda's contributions to her family's charitable work were as creative as they were impactful. She appeared in theatrical productions and starred in tableaux vivants, artistic recreations of famous scenes, for fundraisers. One year, she posed as Summer in a Dresden porcelain-inspired tableau. Another, she adapted children's plays with Mrs. Birkin's players to raise funds for London children's hospitals. Her efforts were more than symbolic gestures. They embodied her commitment to making a difference. When Freda's parents learned of her affair with Edward, they were deeply unsettled. Her father, Colonel Birkin, disapproved so strongly that he refused to invite the prince to Lamcote House for lunch, drawing a firm line between the family's values and his daughter's affair. Still, the affair continued, its whispers growing louder in both London and Nottingham. As Edward's behavior became a subject of court gossip, King George and Queen Mary decided drastic measures were needed. To distance him from Freda and quell the mounting scandal, the prince was sent abroad on an extended royal tour, a journey meant to thank the dominions and colonies for their support. But beneath the surface, it was clear the tour was as much about duty as it was about damage control. Before Edward boarded the HMS Renown, he and Freda exchanged matching spider mascots, tokens of their shared affection and whispered promises. As the ship pulled away, Edward wrote to Freda, confessing that both he and his spider were crying inside. It was a poignant farewell, bittersweet with longing, as Edward vowed fidelity. Yet, as history would reveal, his reality was far more complex. In Canada, Edward was met with overwhelming adoration. Crowds swarmed him, young women throwing themselves at his feet, pleading for kisses, and presenting him with tokens of their admiration. To the public, he was the embodiment of youth, charm, and hope, a living symbol of post-war optimism. Newspapers chronicled his every move, from whose hand he shook to whom he danced with at grand balls. Yet behind the carefully crafted smiles and endless handshakes, Edward longed for Freda. In his letters, he confided the emptiness of it all. The cheers, the gifts, and the relentless adulation felt hollow. "I've had enough of princing," he lamented. "I want to be an ordinary person with a life of my own." The strain of public speaking, constant scrutiny, and the weight of expectations left him exhausted and yearning for her comfort. Ever pragmatic, Freda reminded him that he was born to be king and could never escape that fate, no matter how fervently he wished otherwise. Though Edward's letters professed unwavering devotion, his actions hinted at contradictions. In Canada, he grew close to Sarah Shaughnessy, the American widow of a British peer who had once been Freda's confidant. Their initial conversations revolved around Freda, but soon evolved into nightly dances and private moments. Rumors swirled among Edward's companions, with some speculating he might propose to Sarah as a way to stabilize the monarchy. Sarah herself dismissed the idea, but the flirtation was enough to stir unease. In letters to Freda, Edward downplayed his connection to Sarah, calling her merely a link to Freda, and insisting he considered himself a married man with Freda as his little wife. Edward's despair over the impossibility of their relationship surfaced in startling letters to Freda. In one, he fantasized about escaping their predicament in the most extreme way. "How marvelously divine if only we could die together," he wrote. "I'm just dippy to die with you, even if we can't live together." Amid his darker thoughts, Edward clung to fantasies of a simpler life with Freda. He fell in love with the informality of Canadian life and purchased a ranch in Alberta, dreaming of a future where they could live far from the constraints of royal duty. "If you would move to Canada," he wrote, "I'd never want to return to England." Yet these dreams remained just that. While Edward swore, "I will never marry any other woman but you," he took no tangible steps to make that life a reality, instead placing his faith in time and fate. After a brief return to England, Edward embarked on another tour in March 1920, this time to Australia and New Zealand. Joining him was his cousin, Lord Louis Mountbatten, 6 years his junior, who would soon become Edward's closest confidant. The departure was anything but triumphant. Lord Mountbatten later recalled how Edward wept inconsolably as they left Freda's house for Victoria Station, distraught at the thought of other men pursuing her in his absence. On board the HMS Renown, Edward turned his cabin into a sanctuary of devotion. He adorned the walls with photographs of Freda, and every letter she sent became his lifeline. Days without her words plunged him into despair, and he idolized her to a near spiritual degree. "As people loved once long ago, as they love no more, and as they will never love again," he wrote, echoing her sentiment. Though Edward dreamt of marrying Freda, he seemed paralyzed by his royal obligations, choosing instead to believe that destiny would unite them. In Australia, Edward's charm once again captivated the crowds. Ex-servicemen treated him as one of their own, dragging him from his car, hoisting him onto their shoulders, and slapping his back with such enthusiasm that he was left bruised. His tears at stories of hardship endeared him to the public, solidifying his image as a prince of the people. But behind the scenes, the strain of his double life wore on him. His staff described him as petulant and demanding, prone to tantrums that tested their patience. Even Lord Mountbatten, ever loyal, admitted that Edward was increasingly difficult to console, describing him as a sad and lonely person, envious of Louis's simpler life. Despite his professions of devotion to Freda, Edward's actions continued to tell a different story. In Australia, he developed a fascination with Molly Little, a vivacious woman whose dark, sensuous looks reminded him of Sheila Loughborough, Freda's friend who was in an affair with Edward's brother Bertie. Molly, known for her vulgar reputation and exclusion from official society events, was nonetheless invited to Edward's gatherings at his insistence. While he described her to Freda as someone who had caught Louis's attention, it was clear he himself was infatuated. Lord Mountbatten observed the complexity of Edward's attachment to Freda. "She's been a mother to him," he wrote to his own mother, describing how Edward confided all his troubles in Freda and relied on her advice. Yet even as Edward idolized Freda from afar, his parents seized the opportunity to undermine their relationship. At court, Freda's supporter, Lord Esher, faced ridicule over her nickname, Princess Freda. Discussions about her suitability hinted at future conflicts, with Archbishop Cosmo Lang suggesting that even a bachelor king might be preferable to a match with Freda, a foreshadowing of the abdication crisis. King George's interference extended beyond Edward. He pressured Edward's brother Bertie to end his affair with Sheila Loughborough, rewarding him with the title of Duke of York for his compliance. When Edward learned of these maneuvers, he was furious, writing to Freda with scorn for his father's silly, useless life, and vowing that no royal interference would drive them apart. Freda wrestled with the growing toll of her affair with Edward, on her daughters, her reputation, and her future. The weight of their clandestine love grew heavier with each passing year, and in a moment of resolve, she attempted to end the relationship. Her decision devastated Edward, plunging him into a deep depression. He bombarded her with desperate letters, each one more emotionally charged than the last, pleading with her not to abandon him. Using every form of emotional blackmail, he insisted he couldn't live without her, promising to change if it meant she would stay. Edward's despair reached dangerous depths. In another particularly startling letter, he suggested they escape their impossible situation through death. At other times, he seemed resigned to their friendship, though with a Freudian bent. "From now on, I will look on you only as Freddie Mummy, even though it will be the hardest task of my life. A chap can love his mummy, can't he?" By the autumn of 1920, when Edward returned to England, Freda reluctantly resumed their relationship. She had sold her house on Cumberland Terrace, a poignant symbol of their shared life, hoping to carve out a fresh start. Yet Edward's dependence on her only grew. At social events, friends like Duff Cooper and Winston Churchill noted how he clung to her, unable to mask his obsession. Churchill, always a keen observer, remarked that society had grown weary of the prince's behavior, famously declaring that the door must be either open or shut on the affair. Edward's letters to Freda lay bare the depth of his dependency. He called himself her little slave or puppy, a reflection of his willingness to submit to her emotionally and his reliance on her guidance. Freda became his sanctuary amidst the pressures of royal life, soothing his bouts of depression with her steady presence. But Freda wasn't indulgent. When Edward sank too deeply into self-pity, she would shake him out of it with playful but pointed rebukes, calling him Dismal David when his melancholy threatened to overwhelm him. What set their relationship apart was Freda's ability to treat Edward as an ordinary man. In a world of sycophants who laughed too easily at his jokes and agreed with his every opinion, Freda was different. She challenged him, met him as an equal, and provided the intimacy and honesty he so desperately needed. Edward confided that he had never known another person as well or as deeply as he knew Freda. Despite Freda's efforts to distance herself for the sake of her family and reputation, their reunion reignited the affair. They continued meeting in secret at her home while her husband, Duddy, was away. Edward clung to the belief that one day fate would allow them to be together openly, while Freda, more grounded in reality, understood the impossibility of their love. Biographers like Philip Ziegler have speculated on an alternate reality. What if Freda had been widowed? Could she and Edward have married? While King George and Queen Mary would likely have resisted a union with a middle-class divorcee, Edward's determination and Freda's charm might have swayed them. Perhaps more significantly, the British public, enchanted by their modern, relatable prince, might have welcomed such a match. In 1920, Prime Minister Lloyd George advised the king against a foreign match for the prince, arguing that an English or Scottish noblewoman would be far more palatable to the public. Freda, with her poise, intelligence, and modern sensibilities, might have been the perfect choice to symbolize a forward-looking monarchy. As the graphic observed in 1921, Edward was beloved because he is one of us. The article added, "Prince Charming Cinderella will be found by our English fireside. Not some foreigner. Like the prince himself, his princess will be one of us." Among all the women in Edward's life, no one fit that description more perfectly than Freda Dudley Ward. While Freda cared deeply for Edward, her feelings never equaled the prince's obsessive adoration. She neither demanded exclusivity nor offered it. Edward, in his romantic idealism, seemed to ignore this reality, clinging to her as his sanctuary amidst royal pressures. At the same time, Freda maintained an equally intense affair with Michael Herbert, a close friend of Duff Cooper. He was a charming banker from an aristocratic family whose sister married Cornelius Vanderbilt. Dark-haired and slight, Michael exuded disarming charm and a radiant smile. For Freda, however, Michael offered a mix of passion and dependence that mirrored Edward's devotion. The tension between Edward and Michael simmered beneath the surface, their rivalry a constant shadow in her life. Edward confessed to Freda that he hated Michael with a fervor that passed all understanding. In one letter he wrote, "God, that man makes me angry, sweetheart, and I long to tell him off properly, though I'm not big enough." Michael, equally consumed by jealousy, struggled to hide his insecurities. His letters to Freda were raw and vulnerable, revealing his fear of losing her. "I hate that place," he wrote of Dunrobin Castle, where Edward and Freda spent a blissful fortnight together in the autumn of 1921. Knowing she was with his rival tormented him. "It is becoming an obsession. Darling, it is such an eternity till I shall see you again." At Dunrobin Castle, the childhood home of Edward's former mistress, Rosemary Lucen Gore, Freda and Edward's love flourished. Despite the presence of a large house party, including Freda's husband, they found stolen moments alone. They sneaked into spare bedrooms at night, rekindling their connection with a fervor that left Edward longing for more. For Michael, the separation from Freda was agony. His letters, tinged with desperation, painted a vivid portrait of his longing. "I do so want you, to hold you and kiss you, and tell you that I love you from the crest of your permanent waves to the soles of your shoes." Despite his doubts, Michael's love for Freda was steadfast. "You are my great chance of happiness," he declared. and I can't and won't even consider the possibility of our being permanently separated. While Edward departed for an 8-month tour of India, Freda and Michael shared idyllic days by the sea, moments that Michael described as sheer joy. "I shall remember it always," he wrote, "because I felt more than I have ever felt that we were grandly alone and divinely self-sufficient one to another." Before Edward left for India, he and Freda exchanged matching crosses, symbols of their enduring bond. Edward wore his constantly, clinging to the connection despite the miles between them. To their mutual friend Sheila Loughborough, Edward confessed his anguish. "I do loathe it and hated leaving her far more than even last year." These long separations are really too cruel for words. On board the HMS Renown, Edward poured his emotions into letters to Freda, painting her as the center of his world. Meanwhile, Freda balanced the intensity of her two relationships, each man offering her something unique but equally fleeting. Edward, with his royal obligations, clung to her as his lifeline, while Michael dreamed of a deeper, exclusive love. Both men remained trapped in a cycle of devotion and despair, unable to break free from their entanglement with Freda. Edward's tour of India was overshadowed by the engagements of those closest to him. His cousin, Lord Mountbatten, became engaged to the glamorous heiress Edwina Ashley, their romantic time in Delhi a sharp contrast to Edward's loneliness. Brooding over his separation from Freda, Edward wrote bitterly, "I shall loathe Delhi with Edwina there when you have so much more right to be here than she has." However much they love, they can't possibly love each other a fraction as much as we do. The tour itself was grueling. Edward detested the endless rounds of garden parties and formal dinners, describing his hosts as servile, cringing, and insincere native potentates. His letters were laced with complaints, lamenting the women he was forced to dance with and expressing his mounting frustration with his role as prince. Upon his return to England, he was greeted by cheering crowds and a lavish welcome. At a lunch at the Berkeley Hotel, Freda joined her husband and daughters. Draped in patriotic decorations, the hotel's balconies overflowed with admirers showering rose petals onto Edward's passing carriage. From the window, Freda, resplendent in a black dress and wide-brimmed hat, stood with her daughters, waving flags. Spotting her, Edward smiled and bowed, the moment laden with unspoken longing. In the summer of 1922, Freda retreated to a seaside villa in Frinton with her daughters. Days were filled with tennis, golf, and swims in the sea, while the girls played on the beach with friends. The lively atmosphere was enhanced by the presence of close companions like Clementine Churchill. Both Michael and Edward visited her in Frinton when her husband Duddy was away, though their paths occasionally crossed. At a Wilton House dance, an unexpected camaraderie emerged. Without Freda there, Michael and Edward agreed that parties were dull and found themselves laughing together. "I've never really talked to Michael properly before, but he's very amusing and great fun," Edward later admitted, a rare moment of civility between the rivals. His letters to Freda revealed his turmoil. "Oh, mine's a lovely life now, isn't it, Freddie darling? I so often think of chucking in the sponge, especially lately, but the knowledge that you love me, my precious beloved sweetheart, does keep me going and makes my foul life worth living." While Edward battled his inner demons, Freda juggled her complex relationships and public commitments. During the November 1922 general election, she campaigned tirelessly for her husband in Southampton. Despite his eloquent speeches, Duddy's long absences from the constituency cost him the election. His defeat marked the end of his political career and led to extended stays in Canada, giving Freda more freedom to navigate her entangled relationships with Edward and Michael. As pressure mounted for Edward to marry, he repeatedly proposed to Freda, promising her the world. "The only thing I want in the world is to be with you always," he wrote. "It would break my heart if you stopped loving me." He even vowed to abandon everything for her. "I would just nip off with you at any moment and to any place in the world if you make up your mind to do so." But Freda, ever practical, turned him down. She knew the constraints of royal life and the stigma surrounding divorce made their marriage impossible. "You will always be mine, darling," Edward assured her, but Freda remained unconvinced. Michael Herbert, too, grew impatient. Sharing Freda with the prince was unbearable, and his letters brimmed with anguish. "If you are unfaithful to me, I shall strangle you and drown myself. It's awful how I love you." He begged her to take decisive action, lamenting the wasted years and longing for a future together. Divorce briefly surfaced as a possibility in 1922, causing Edward great anxiety as he feared Freda might choose Michael over him. Yet Freda ultimately decided against it. Divorce would risk her custody of her daughters and jeopardize Michael's career at Morgan Grenfell, where strict moral codes forbade marrying divorcees. Despite Michael's assurances that they could still live comfortably, Freda refused, unwilling to gamble with her children's futures. Edward, though consumed by his love for Freda, was not known for fidelity. He pursued Freda's younger sister Vera, calling her a second-best substitute when Freda was unavailable. At one point, Edward and Freda even joked about him marrying Vera. "I love her a little bit because she's your sister," he admitted. In 1923, a new threat emerged to Freda's hold on Edward: Audrey Dudley Coates. Audrey was a striking figure in London society, captivating with her sharp wit and smoky gray eyes. Known for her ability to manipulate admirers, she had left a trail of besotted suitors, including Lord Mountbatten, who once described her as a clever little minx with a most kissable mouth. Her irreverent charm delighted Edward, and her vulnerability, particularly after losing a child in 1923, drew him closer. While Freda focused her attention on Michael, Edward turned to Audrey, both as a reprisal and a refuge. In one bitter letter to Freda, he confessed, "You want a damn good shaking, Freddie. That's what you want. Bad, Freddie." Edward's growing attachment to Audrey drove him into reckless behavior. He began drinking heavily and was often seen out with her at London's Embassy Club. Reflecting on this period, Edward later admitted to Freda, "I went quite mad and off my nut." Freda, once again, tried to end things with Edward and laid out new terms. They could remain friends, but Edward could no longer make emotional demands on her. From then on, she referred to him as her devoted little chum. Despite her boundaries, Edward struggled to accept them. He continued pouring out his feelings in letters, writing of his insufferable loneliness and confessing his escapades with Audrey, all while assuring Freda, "I do fancy Audrey a lot and am fond of her, but I'm not madly in love and never will be again. She'll never mean a fraction to me of what you do." In 1923, Edward faced one of the greatest scandals of his life, the Maggie Mellor trial. Maggie, a French courtesan with whom Edward had a past affair, used his letters to bargain with authorities during her murder trial. To avoid public disgrace, the royal household struck a deal to recover the incriminating correspondence, ensuring neither Maggie's relationship with Edward nor his name was mentioned in court. During this crisis, Edward turned to Freda for support, and she spent the days in London comforting him during the trial. Before Edward departed for his ranch in Canada in the autumn of 1923, Freda confessed that she was in love with Michael. Edward was deeply hurt, writing, "It's a horrid thought for me that I mean nothing to you now, though you mean the hell of a lot to me." During their emotional conversation, Freda confronted Edward about his self-pity and spoiled behavior. Surprisingly, Edward accepted her criticism, thanking her for showing me myself. He promised to work on his flaws during his time away, but upon returning to England, he threw himself at her feet, claiming he could not live without her. Reluctantly, she again took Edward back, and the affair resumed. By July 1924, the rivalry between Edward and Michael reached a boiling point during a society treasure hunt. At one hunt, Freda persuaded both men to share a car with her, creating an awkward and tense dynamic. Michael, flushed with pride after a successful hunt, clashed with Edward, who remained charming and unbothered. Observing the scene, Duff Cooper remarked, "Michael was terribly proprietary over Freda in front of Edward." Despite Michael's longing for exclusivity, he had no choice but to accept Freda's divided affections. Michael's emotional demands often escalated into arguments. During one heated exchange, Freda lashed out, telling him she gained nothing from their relationship and took no pleasure in being with him. Devastated, Michael admitted his faults, writing, "I know I've bullied you and been awful. I'll change, I promise. I'll be more reasonable and won't worry you so much or be so jealous." Freda's tangled love life extended its strain to her family. Her father, Colonel Birkin, disapproved of both Edward and Michael, banning them from the family estate. When Freda's younger sister Vera married Major James Seeley in February 1925, Edward's dramatic entrance threatened to overshadow the bride. Arriving just minutes before the ceremony, the Prince of Wales was met with cheers and applause, prompting guests to climb onto pews to catch a glimpse. The prince's presence sparked a heated argument between Colonel Birkin and Edward, with Freda's mother, Claire, stepping in to smooth things over. While Edward toured South Africa in 1925, Freda's letters grew infrequent, leaving him anxious and suspicious. Writing almost daily, he feared Michael Herbert was deliberately preventing Freda from replying. "I wouldn't be surprised to hear that Freda has run away with him," Edward wrote bitterly. Meanwhile, Audrey Coates, Edward's other mistress, continued to write to him regularly, but her eager availability made her less appealing, with the prince's equerry writing. "I don't think Edward cares two straws about her, except for purely physical reasons." Edward's devotion to Freda was obvious to all, with Winston Churchill writing to his wife Clementine in 1927, "Edward's love for Freda is so obvious and undisguisable, it's quite pathetic." By 1927, Freda sought a way out of the toxic cycle created by her relationships with Edward, Michael, and her husband Duddy. She found solace in a new affair with American polo player Rodman Wanamaker, a member of one of America's wealthiest families. Rodman whisked Freda away to Paris and Palm Beach, where she reveled in the luxury of his estate. Days were spent swimming and playing golf, while nights brought lavish dinners on palm-framed terraces at the Colony Club alongside Vanderbilts and other elite socialites. Freda's affair with Rodman devastated Michael Herbert, whose health had already begun to deteriorate. He wrote to her daily pleading for reassurance. "If you do not write to show me you love me, it will just be murder, for it will kill me." Edward, too, struggled with Freda's absence. His heavy drinking escalated. One night, Edward was so intoxicated at a casino that he couldn't stand, prompting his assistant private secretary to report to Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin that Edward was rapidly going to the devil and would be an unfit monarch. The private secretary admitted he sometimes wished Edward might suffer a fatal accident during one of his dangerous point-to-point races, a sentiment Baldwin grimly echoed. In 1928, Edward sought distraction through a hastily planned tour of East Africa. From there, he wrote to Freda lamenting their separation. "It's so damned silly that we're not married. You'd be happier with me than with any bloody papapacker." Despite his longing for Freda, Edward indulged in flirtations, wild parties, and scandalous behavior. During one drunken dinner, Lady Delamere threw bread at Edward, accidentally striking Karen Blixen, author of Out of Africa, and giving her a black eye. Later, charging Edward from across the room, knocking his chair over and wrestling him on the floor. Edward's private secretary despaired over the prince's antics, describing him as behaving more like the son of an American millionaire than the future King of England. While Edward partied in Africa, the king's health declined dangerously. When urgent cables reached Edward, he delayed his return to complete a romantic liaison with Mrs. Barnes, the wife of a local commissioner. His negligence deepened concerns about his fitness for the throne. Meanwhile, Freda's 2-year affair with Rodman Wanamaker disrupted her relationships with both Edward and Michael. In letters, Edward expressed resignation. "I do now at last realize that you can't feel quite the same as you used to, and that you have other interests and friends, which prevent you being as much in my life as I want you to be." By the late 1920s, Edward turned his attention to Lady Thelma Furness, beginning an affair that would last several years. But throughout the entire affair, he continued to write to Freda and put her first in his thoughts. Michael Herbert remained deeply in love with Freda, despite the growing emotional distance. Writing to her, he described every moment apart as time stolen from my short life. His health continued to decline, and he increasingly saw himself as a fellow victim of Edward's hold over Freda. Freda's daughters, now blossoming into beautiful young women, were entering their own worlds of romance and society. Sent to Munich to study German, Pempe fell in love with the much older head of the opera. In June 1930, Freda finally divorced her husband on the grounds of adultery. The case named Lillian Gallifant of West Kensington as the correspondent, with the alleged infidelity taking place at the Hotel Metropole in Brighton. At the time, divorce was a complicated and stigmatized process. It required not only proof of adultery, but assurances that the couple was not colluding to stage the affair. Wealthy couples, like the Dudley Wards, often orchestrated hotel bill cases, where a woman would be hired to be caught in a compromising situation with the husband. Dudley, ever the gentleman, allowed himself to be the one blamed, thus sparing Freda's blushes. In court, Freda testified that she and her husband had ceased living together 5 years prior, though they had maintained friendly relations. The judge granted Freda the divorce, awarding her custody of their 2 daughters, and the Dudley Wards remained close. For Michael Herbert, Freda's divorce came too late. His health had been deteriorating for years, and as he became too unwell to work, he spent his days in the garden, staring into space and waiting for a letter, a phone call, or a visit from Freda. His letters reflected his anguish. "I didn't know it was possible to long for anything like I long for you. I can't think of anything else." In September 1932, Michael passed away at his home in Mayfair at just 39 years old. The official cause of death was an abscess on his lung and cerebral toxemia. Freda was devastated. Her family would later recall that Michael, not Edward or her husband, was the great love of her life. Michael's will reflected the seriousness of their relationship. Just before undergoing surgery in August, he left £80,000, nearly a fifth of his fortune, to Freda. Within 2 years, Freda suffered more devastating losses. Her father, Colonel Birkin, never fully recovered from his war injuries and passed away in 1932 at the age of 67. Soon after, her mother Claire became ill. During a visit to France, she underwent gallbladder surgery and died from complications in 1934, with Freda by her side. Now, without her husband, her lover, or her parents, Freda faced a new chapter in her life. Edward, the Prince of Wales, could have been the sole man in her world. Unlike Wallis Simpson, who pushed to marry Edward after her divorce, Freda made no such demands. Her relationship with the prince had already passed its peak, and though he remained devoted to her, she continued to accept her role in his life without asking for more. Yet it was Freda, not Edward, who decided they should see less of one another. Friends believed she could win him back if she wanted to, but it appeared she no longer did. At any rate, his current mistress Thelma would soon introduce Edward to Wallis Simpson, signaling the beginning of the end for Edward's relationship with Freda, as Edward was soon to cut all ties. For more on Edward's relationship with Thelma and his introduction to Wallis, please see the video on the channel. Edward's departure from Freda's life left lingering echoes in the lives of her daughters, Angie and Pempy. Angie, who had adored Edward, clung to the memory of their bond through a single photograph he had sent her, inscribed, "Darling Angie from Little Prince." For Pempy, the more pragmatic of the two, disillusionment had set in. By the affair's end, she had grown to disapprove of her mother's entanglement, viewing Edward not as a charming prince, but as a distraction from their family's stability. Even within the royal family, Freda's departure created a void. Lord Mountbatten later remarked, "She was sweet and good, a stabilizing influence. None of the others were." Edward may have left her life, but Freda's steadfast compassion endured. Their shared concern for the struggles of Britain's unemployed during the Great Depression became a catalyst for her most enduring contribution. Edward had often lamented the ineffectiveness of existing charities, telling Freda, "The wrong sort of people run these clubs. Someone like you should take charge." In 1934, Freda turned his words into action, founding the Feathers Club Association to aid London's most vulnerable. The clubs became havens for the unemployed, offering not just food and companionship, but also practical skills training. She enlisted figures like the Duke and Duchess of Kent and Winston Churchill, who publicly championed her cause. Her commitment transcended institutional efforts. Freda's generosity also extended to her family, particularly her sister Violet, whose marriage had unraveled under the weight of financial ruin and addiction. Freda took Violet's daughter, Bindi, into her home, offering her the stability her mother could not. Bindi, tempestuous and rebellious, idolized her aunt, who remained a patient and steady presence through her troubled youth. With her own daughters, Freda fostered a unique blend of freedom and influence. Angie later recalled, "We could do whatever we wanted, but we wouldn't have wanted to upset her." When Angie tearfully confessed a mistake, Freda's response was filled with warmth. "Don't worry, darling. We all make mistakes." Freda's magnetism drew an array of remarkable people into her orbit. During a stay at Sir Philip Sassoon's Port Lympton estate, the artist Rex Whistler fell for Pempy, later immortalizing Freda's daughters in a portrait exhibited at the Royal Academy. Brendan Bracken, Churchill's confidant and chairman of the Financial Times, was one of Freda's most devoted admirers. His affection for the family ran so deep that when Angie lost her cherished doll on a train in France, he hired a detective to retrieve it, a gesture that revealed not just his devotion to Freda, but his empathy for her family. Brendan also championed Freda's charitable endeavors. In 1935, he wrote to Churchill, advocating for her appointment to the Central Housing Advisory Committee. Her knowledge of housing issues and her dedication to the underprivileged is unmatched, he wrote. Churchill, a longtime admirer, readily endorsed her appointment, calling her an extraordinary candidate. Freda's friendship with Winston Churchill was a relationship of mutual respect and admiration. Few could pierce the veil of his darker moods, but Freda's charm and conversational wit often coaxed him out of his gloom. Bracken remarked, "She could lift him out of his funks like no one else." Among her companions was Eric, Lord Dudley, the widower of Rosemary Lewson Gore, who had been the first love of Prince Edward. For more on her story, please see our video on the channel. Himley Hall, his stately home, became the stage for glittering house parties that masked his lingering sorrow. For Eric, Freda was a source of solace, and his affection for her deepened. But Freda, wary of yet another entanglement within Edward's orbit, resisted. Even after Edward turned his attention to Wallis Simpson, Eric remained close to him, hosting the Prince and Wallis at Himley Hall in 1936. Freda, however, had grown weary of these tightly knit social dynamics. When Eric proposed, she declined, determined to untangle herself from the emotional threads still binding her to Edward. Instead, she embraced a new chapter with Pedro José Isidro Manuel Ricardo Moniz, the Marquis de Casamauri, known simply as Bobby, or to his critics, the Cuban heel. Bobby was unlike anyone Freda had known. A Spanish-Cuban aristocrat, he lived with daring flair, racing Bugatti cars, piloting planes blessed with holy water, and commanding a schooner that was the envy of the yachting world. His unpredictable charm and adventurous spirit brought Freda an invigorating sense of freedom and escape from the rigid expectations of English society. As Freda's romance blossomed, her daughters, Angie and Pempy, began forging their own paths. Pempy, with her luminous beauty and innate poise, made her film debut in Escape Me Never in 1935, drawing comparisons to Greta Garbo. Her next film, Moscow Nights, co-starring Laurence Olivier, cemented her as one of British cinema's rising stars. Even the Duke of Kent attended her premiere. But Edward, now ensnared by Wallis Simpson, was conspicuously absent. That summer, Freda, Pempy, and Bobby escaped the relentless social whirl of London for the serene beauty of Carlion Bay, Cornwall. With Hollywood stars like Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Gertrude Lawrence in tow, the days passed in idyllic calm, swimming in seawater pools and exploring quaint fishing villages. It was a Riviera-like respite, offering Freda a rare sense of tranquility. Freda's younger daughter, Angie, stepped into the spotlight in her own way. At just 18, she married Captain Robert Bob Laycock of the Royal Horse Guards in January 1935. The ceremony, held at St. Margaret's, Westminster, was a glittering event. Seats were reserved for members of the Feathers Clubs, Freda's charitable initiative, allowing even the less privileged to join the celebration. Amid the joy, a shadow lingered. Angela, still fond of Edward from her childhood, begged her mother to invite him. Freda relented, but Edward's silence was deafening. He neither attended nor sent a card. Wallis Simpson would later reveal that Edward dismissed the event entirely, a chilling reminder of his capacity to sever ties without hesitation. In October 1937, Freda and Bobby married in an understated ceremony. The ceremony was intimate, the honeymoon a romantic escape to Paris. While Freda's world moved toward modernity, Edward's shifted toward infamy. That same year, now the Duke of Windsor, Edward and Wallis Simpson made their infamous visit to Nazi Germany. They dined with Goering, Himmler, and even Hitler, an encounter that would forever shadow Edward's legacy. Meanwhile, Freda and Bobby were designing their bold Art Deco home in Hamilton Terrace, a gleaming modern marvel featured in Ideal Home magazine. Its mirrored interiors, blue-tinted bricks, and cutting-edge technology reflected Freda's passion for innovation. Her creativity didn't stop there. She developed 6 townhouses in Regent's Park, proudly calling them "my own creation." Freda's family also blossomed in their own ways. Angie, now married, had given birth to Tilly, earning Freda the affectionate title of the slimmest and smartest grandmother in London. Her eldest daughter, Pempy, shone in the spotlight, transitioning from British cinema to the American stage. She debuted in Noel Coward's Set to Music in 1938, her ethereal beauty and magnetic presence earning her acclaim. World War II brought a different kind of challenge. Freda's Feathers Club Association, born to combat unemployment, became a lifeline during the Blitz. The clubs provided meals, nurseries, and safe spaces for Londoners navigating blackouts and bombings. Even as bombs fell, Freda's resilience shone. Churchill himself recognized her efforts, donating £500 and allocating royalties from his wartime speeches. Her work was a lifeline for countless families, with air raid shelters and evening dances offering moments of normalcy amidst chaos. Brendan Bracken, one of her most devoted friends, marveled at her ability to uplift even Winston Churchill during his darkest hours. Freda's presence wasn't just inspiring, it was transformative, leaving an indelible mark on all who knew her. In January 1941, Freda joined Winston and Clementine Churchill at a weekend house party at Ditchley Park. With the Battle of Britain raging, Churchill had moved key meetings there, deeming his official residence, Chequers, too vulnerable to bombing raids. That weekend proved pivotal. Among the carefully selected guests was Harry Hopkins, President Roosevelt's trusted advisor, visiting to discuss U.S. support for Britain. Over candlelit dinners and private film screenings, conversations laid the foundation for the Lend-Lease program, a critical turning point in the Allies' strategy. Freda, ever discreet yet captivating, moved effortlessly through the gathering, her charm contributing to the evening's success. The war's devastation soon struck Freda personally. Bombing raids reduced the homes she had developed at Wells Rise to rubble, a stark reminder of the conflict's reach. Yet, Freda's resilience shone through as her charitable work expanded in step with her daughter Angela's contributions. Angie, with Freda's support, ran the canteen at COHQ and organized fundraisers for the Commando Benevolent Fund, providing aid to families of servicemen. On the front lines, Angie's husband, Robert Laycock, emerged as a military figure of renown. Nicknamed Lucky Laycock, he spearheaded the creation of the Commandos, leading daring missions in Crete and North Africa. In contrast, Freda's husband, Bobby, faced disgrace following his role in a failed raid while overseeing military intelligence for Lord Mountbatten. The failure led to his resignation, casting a shadow over his wartime service. In October 1943, Laycock achieved a historic milestone, becoming the youngest major general in the British Army at just 36. Succeeding Mountbatten, he was appointed Chief of Combined Operations, playing a critical role in planning the Allied landings in Europe. His achievements were honored in the 1945 New Year's Honors, where he was made a Companion of the Order of the Bath. By 1947, Laycock resigned from the Army to focus on his growing family. From 1954 to 1959, he served as governor of Malta, deftly balancing political tensions with the joys of family life on the idyllic island. Bobby, her charming but unfaithful husband, had been engaging in multiple affairs, one of them with Laura, the second wife of Freda's longtime friend, Eric, Lord Dudley. Laura, young and overwhelmed by the legacy of Eric's first wife, Rosemary, found herself drawn to Bobby, despite his reputation for fleeting dalliances. Aware of her husband's betrayals, Freda discreetly employed private detectives to confirm her suspicions. Initially hesitant to divorce Bobby due to the potential scandal, she eventually decided she could no longer endure the emotional toll. In 1954, she divorced him on the grounds of adultery, coinciding with Eric's divorce from Laura. Bobby's affair with Laura fizzled shortly after, and remarkably, Freda maintained civility with her ex-husband. When Bobby fell ill in his later years, she even moved him into a neighboring flat to care for him during his final days. Though admirers surrounded her, Freda never sought another long-term commitment. She remained close to Eric and formed a deep intellectual connection with politician Kenneth Lindsay, a collaborator on Feathers Club projects. While Kenneth was deeply infatuated with her, Freda's emotional independence and extensive commitments left him longing for more than she could provide, straining their relationship. Duff Cooper, reflecting on her legacy, wrote, "There has never been a more charming and attractive woman. Her beauty never faded. She always looked young, and I never saw her look anything but lovely." This magnetic allure defined her relationships, balancing glamour with an innate compassion for others. In her late 60s, Freda continued her tireless work with the Feathers Club Association, dedicated to helping disadvantaged youth in London's slums. Under her leadership, the association provided a lifeline for troubled youth, offering safe spaces, skill-building activities, and guidance to keep them from entering the judicial system. Freda's hands-on approach remained unwavering. She organized jumble sales, hosted glittering fundraising dances attended by luminaries like Vivian Leigh, and rarely missed a meeting. Yet official recognition eluded her. Winston Churchill twice recommended her for honors, but the accolades never came, perhaps due to political distractions or Freda's own humility. As Lord Dudley observed, she likely would have declined such recognition, believing her work's impact mattered far more than titles. By the mid-1960s, Freda passed the leadership of the Feathers Club Association to her daughter Pempy, but she remained an integral part of the charity, her warmth and wit endearing her to all who knew her. Despite her storied past, she remained grounded, nurturing lifelong friendships with figures like Nancy Astor and Clemmy Churchill, while doting on her 7 grandchildren. As she aged, Freda's humor and charm endured. At a family gathering, she quipped, "But I only had 2 children," when marveling at the large turnout. Her legacy extended far beyond her charity work. It lived in the relationships she nurtured and the countless lives she touched. Remarkably, Freda rarely spoke of her affair with Edward, the Prince of Wales. Even her family remained largely unaware of its depth until her granddaughter Martha stumbled upon it through Frances Donaldson's biography. When asked, Freda dismissed it with a wry smile. It was all so long ago. For her, life was about moving forward, not dwelling on the past. In her later years, Freda reflected on the prince's cold rejection of her calls without bitterness, telling her great niece, "All those things seem so important at the time, but when you get to my age, none of it matters." It was a philosophy she carried through her life, focusing on the present and cherishing the connections that remained. As their circle grew smaller, with old friends passing away, Diana Cooper wrote to her saying they should see more of each other. Freda, with her unflinching honesty, responded, "Well, we never really got on well, no point in starting now." Freda faced personal tragedies in her final years, including the devastating loss of her eldest daughter, Pempy, to a brain tumor in 1982. Yet she remained the emotional cornerstone of her family, offering wisdom, support, and humor even amidst her grief. In 1983, at the age of 88, Freda passed away while visiting her daughter Angie in Spain. After her death, a suitcase containing letters from the Prince of Wales and her first love, Michael Herbert, was discovered. A few months before she died, her great-granddaughter asked if she feared death, to which Freda replied, "It was perfectly okay before I was born, so I'm sure it will be all right after I'm dead." Freda Dudley Ward's life was a testament to resilience, wit, and quiet strength. She navigated the glittering heights of Edwardian society and the heartbreak of forbidden love with grace and humor. Even as tragedy cast its shadow, she remained a poignant reminder that history is often shaped not by crowns, but by courage. As her great-niece, Lady Isabella Naylor Leyland, so beautifully put it, Freda had an extraordinary ability to make everyone feel special, yet she never sought to shine herself. In the end, Freda embraced life's simplest, profound truths: love, loss, and the power of moving forward. Though she stepped out of history's spotlight, for those who knew her, her brilliance still lingers. What do you think of Freda? Could she have saved Edward from his downfall, or was his fate sealed by his own choices? Share your thoughts below, and if untold stories of remarkable women captivate you, please subscribe and help us keep their legacies alive. Thank you for watching this week's video on Freda Dudley Ward. With over 70 women's biographies on the channel, your likes, shares, and comments ensure these stories reach more people. A heartfelt thank you to our Patreon supporters: Velocity Girl, ZenLife68, Jillian Barker, Junie Moon, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafam Chung, Harry Thurston, Michelle Lynn Neal, Karen Craig, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Elizabeth, CTS Bathory, America Marie, Amber Perry, Amanda Lynn, Snowball, The Inappropriate Heifer, Kendra McNally, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Ida Kloster Jensen, Kay Philomene, Jules Mack, Black Knight 5897, Sammy Lott, and Maureen Thompson. Your belief in this project makes it all possible. A special congratulations to this week's trivia winner, Lisa Craig 4585. Well done. And to everyone who watches to the end, thank you. Our growth has been amazing, and I'm grateful to have you all with us on this journey. Until next week, stay curious, keep exploring history, and as always, thank you for watching.